Hey, how's everybody doing today? Good? Okay, I'm here to talk about something that I sort of learned the hard way, right? I got introduced to the world of big data while back, and I never paid attention to how it worked. All I actually really cared about was how I could use it, what people wanted me to use it, more importantly, and write code for it, and how quickly can I get the results. I actually didn't care about what is underneath what people call big data, right? Until one, let's say, fateful day when we had to analyze a lot of data in a hurry, and suddenly you couldn't really get a big data setup ready just to analyze that set of data, right? The way the big data systems are built. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. So the way the big data systems are built, they take a lot of setup, a lot of maintenance, a lot of, what is the correct term? Shepherding for people to be able to use it, right? And that's not really great when you have like a short time frame and a slightly larger than usual data chunk, right? So the real question at that point was, when did it go from small data to big data for us, right? And it becomes immediately clear that big data is a historical fiction, right? A GB today is not big data, right? How many of you here have laptops with more than 1 GB RAM? Okay, how many of you have less than 1 GB RAM? Okay, I would probably be unless you have a netbook, you probably have at least 1 GB of RAM. But go back 10 years ago and 2001, when C is the same, C++ is the same, Linux is pretty much the same. Well, it has gotten much better at doing some other things, but as far as utilizing memory is concerned, we are pretty much in the same ballpark as we were 10 years ago, except now what used to be big data in 2001 is no longer big data now, right? So, however you put it, big data is going to be only historically significant at any given point of time. What I call big data today, say a petabyte, is probably not going to look like big data in a few years. Or what would have been a massive quantity of data in 1970 would be a minuscule amount of data now. How many of you have ever thought about allocating 4 KB for something random and never bothered to free it, right? It's 4 KB of RAM would have been a luxury at a point in history, whereas now it is something that you use as a buffer, and don't deallocate it because you just want to keep reusing it, and probably you'll need it again. You don't care. But there is one difference though. The most obvious difference here is that the amount of data that we used to be able to store in computers versus the amount of data we can actually comprehend, right? At some point in the evolution of computers, there would have been a point where a person sitting with a sheet of paper would be able to like look at all the data that the computer is processing right now, right? That the term spreadsheet, right, comes from people actually sitting with a sheet of paper that is actually bigger than one single page and actually like adding stuff in columns and rows, right? The idea that you could actually process data manually and then suddenly automate it seemed like an improvement in efficiency. But at the levels that we are looking at the levels of data that we are looking at now, it is not even practical to comprehend how much data we have, right? How many zeros are there in a petabyte? Itself will like tell you that I can't count that high in my lifetime, right? Even if I just keep going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it will take more time than my lifetime to actually count that much, that high. So even though it is a historical fiction to some extent, it does have some reality in terms of the amount of data or the amount of data points it contains and how it relates to our ability to comprehend data. Now the flip side of it is that as advances in storage become better and better and better, the progress is not in any fashion linear. you cannot actually rely on technology to catch up with you so that you can build bigger and bigger and bigger machines. So I'm putting forth like a very simplistic example of when it went from small data to big data for me was the day the data stopped fitting in my RAM, right? The day I could not write a program that could load all my data into RAM and do whatever I want with it was the day I had to actually go back and redo some stuff. And in the process of redoing that stuff, I managed to discover that that is the literal junction where you actually take a departure from everything you have learned about how to handle data in small systems to how you handle data in big systems. And unfortunately, or well, fortunately, most of what I actually found out by like reading by myself at that point was stuff that people had come up with like a century ago. Now, the first real big data exercise in the world was the US Census, right? And I mean that in terms of the number of data points. So, when 1890-ish period, Herman Hollerith, the guy who founded IBM, when he came up with the punch card and a way to actually process data far quicker than a human could, and far more efficiently than a human could, a lot of the problems that he had to solve are exactly the same problems that I am looking at today. When I look at data dump of, say, an ad log server, and I try to analyze it by demographic, by action, by any metric that I want, I'm actually going back and looking at what they had to do for the census at some point in the history of computing. So basically, if you wanted to figure out how many women existed in the United States of America, that problem is no different from looking at how many people in a particular demographic click on a particular ad. In the 100 years that have gone, not 100, 120 years that have gone between these 2 points in history, the essential problem and the essential activity that you're doing over data hasn't changed. And then it becomes clearer that some of the mechanisms that were used at that point, at that point in history are equally applicable today, right? For example, calculating an average income of an American from a tax report, right? At that point, what they could have done, like America didn't have income tax back then, but it's besides the point. But what they would have done at that point, based on declared income, would exactly be the same as what we would do today. Except then they had to actually rely on cards and filing cabinets for data storage and organization mechanisms, which now we would probably call paging, right? You just take a stack of cards from one particular place, process them, produces another set of cards, put them somewhere else, and mark it somewhere that, okay, so this is the output for that data, right? If you had to average through a large amount of data, you basically did the same thing that you're doing today. You basically added all of it up, counted all of it up, and kept counting all the subtotals until you finally actually got to like a total sum of the numbers you had and the total number of items you had. That's what you got as an average, which in some sense explains why the median calculations in statistics are considered very painful, because they have to look at the entire data. They can't be really subdivided easily without probably losing accuracy, right? So in some sense, despite the fact that that one piece of paper holds very little data and that flash drive holds 1 GB of data, the way we process data that we cannot fit into single processing space or memory remains exactly the same as before. Now, the counting operation in some sense is a deduplication operation, right? Basically, you want to actually like figure out how much data you have, and you want to figure out how many people there are in a country. And there is only one concept that has remained the same throughout the history of these 100 years. It is that any problem that you can divide and conquer is something that is applicable to big data in any fashion. Any problem that you cannot divide and you cannot subdivide into sub-problems that you can solve elsewhere is probably not going to be useful for big data. So, in a very short sense of the word, anything that you can call embarrassingly parallel would actually qualify as a big data problem, right? How many of you here have multiple CPUs in their laptop? Okay, I'm guessing almost everybody has multiple CPUs in their laptop, right? We have multiple CPUs in our laptop because in some sense we have hit the fundamental limits of making faster chips with silicon, right? And it is not exactly that we have hit limits of silicon. It is that in some sense the amount of heat we generate in a chip is so high that we can't actually push it further without cooling it, right? So as you hit those fundamental limits of computing, of what you can do in a single computational unit, you start to actually use the same techniques you used before. You tend to have many of those. You tend to distribute tasks between all of those. And then you try to combine all of those, right? Big data is pretty much the same thing, except instead of being sitting on one computer, right, your processing units are sitting all across your network. Instead of reading from one memory unit, you're actually reading from something that looks like a disk into a temporary unit, processing it and writing back to what looks like a disk. The same way you would interact with, say, multiple programs talking via IPC on a Linux machine, right? The inter-process communication mechanisms that we used to look at, primarily files in this case, is almost identical to how you would want to look at a big data system, right? With some little differences, right? For example, on most computers, all the RAM is equally accessible by all CPUs, right? So you don't actually have to separate RAM between CPUs. Whereas in a big data system, you can't have that assumption. Like, you can get closer to it with things like InfiniBand and NUMA systems, which used to exist before, and InfiniBand exists now. But as far as the problems that we are looking at now, those are expensive hardware solutions, whereas we were actually looking at figuring out how to use software solutions to actually use all the hardware we already have, right? So there is only one real concept to big data processing, that is divide and conquer. Now, as I mentioned earlier, that the storage requirement is one of the few things that big data is actually limited by. Now, the divide and conquer approach equally applies to storage as it applies to processing, right? How you actually store data, how you archive data is very important to how you want to process it later, right? For instance, a set of hard drives behave very differently from what if you had a set of tape drives, right? Because of the way you will access data. So you would want to actually tailor how you store data in a fashion that you can actually divide and conquer and read parts of it, or read the part that you're actually interested in. So the primary requirement for a big data system used to be being able to find the data you're looking for, right? We have solved that problem to a large extent by dividing a storage up in ways which are semantically distributed. Basically, if I tell you that for this particular user, I need to go to machine X, look in this part of their disk, and then I can look in whatever way I want, right? Is a valid way of distributing data, which gives you like ability to store large amounts of data and retrieve large amounts of data, or more importantly, retrieve small amount of data from a large amount of data as and when you need it, right? So that's the point that big data was at when I hit the system. So basically what we had in some sense was a set of MySQL databases where you had just thrown data left, right and center, right? User 1, go to MySQL data 1. User 2, go somewhere else. And you had taken all your data and just thrown it in such a way where you could pick up any bits of it as you wanted. But unfortunately, one of the most painful things in that process is that you no longer can read user 1's data and user 4's data in the same machine. They're not sitting in the same machine. So you need a separate system which has to actually be able to actually count all those data chunks from different places. So distribution of data is the primary item in divide and conquer, because unless your data is distributed, you probably can't distribute your tasks. Distribution of processing is the second thing. And the fact that some of the algorithms that have been built, well, not algorithms, some of the processing that we want to do is inherently distributable is the last part of it. Like the average example I explained. You can't take an average of averages, but you can take a sum of sums and a sum of counts, right? Let's start with the simplest example. So, how many of you here are unfamiliar with the shell commands? Okay. So basically what I'm actually going to describe here are Unix shell commands, which sort of map to how we actually do big data processing, right? This particular example maps to one of the most common problems used to demonstrate big data, which is to take a large amount of data and try to calculate a unique number of items, or the count of unique number of items, or a unique subset. Basically calculation of a set from a large collection. Now, for example, in a Unix environment, if I had a file with large number of names, and I had to, let's pick a better example. If I had to figure out the vocabulary of a particular person, like if I wanted to take two books and compare their vocabulary, right? One of the ways that I would actually start by doing is to cut the book up into separate words, right? And try to find out how many unique words there are, right? Maybe I won't want to find exactly how many unique words there are. Maybe I want to like remove all plurals. I want to convert every plural into singular form. Maybe I want to convert every is B was into all of them into B, so that I could actually count actually what the vocabulary of the person is, right? So I might take my input and pass it through what is commonly known as a stemming filter, right? You take the word, figure out the root word for it, give the root word out, and make a list of all the root words in the book. So the apostrophe S's disappear, the capitalized names disappear. Eventually, I'll end up with a list which contains a large number of repetitions of the same word. Now, the most common and the most simplest way that we do this thing in Unix is to sort it first and then unique it. Now, I probably don't need to explain how sort works when you can do all of it in memory, because that is one of the most fundamental bits of computer programming that we do these days. But the way unique works is that unique sort of tries to not use all the memory you have, right? Unique tries to go through the data that you have already sorted, sort of from top to down or left to right, depending on which way you look at it, and print out the key or the word whenever you encounter the word for the first time. And after you encounter it for the first time, you never actually bother about the word when it happens again in the same sequence, right? So if I write A, B, A will be printed, B will be printed, A will be printed, right? Now the reason to do this is so that Unique doesn't have to keep track of the entire data set. It basically has to only keep track of the current key and the previous key, right? Now, no matter how big your data is, you only need the storage space of 2 keys to do that particular processing. So in that sense, Unique is very efficient, but sort isn't, right? What sort really needs is to keep all the data in memory at the same time and go through all of it in various forms to be able to sort it. You need to be able to compare every item to every other item to be able to sort it. But the unique sort comes with a tiny little bit of help there, right? It comes with a sort and a merge sort, right? So in this particular example, what I'm actually doing is that instead of like processing all the data in one go, let's take a random example. Assuming that you have 4 GB of data and you have 2 GB of RAM, you probably want to process the first 2 GB of RAM first, or rather first 2 GB of the input first in RAM, and then the second 2 GB of input in RAM. But then you're stuck with 2 files which are already sorted, but which are in no order related to each other. Right? So you would need to do something that combines the 2 data items without actually taking up 4 GB of RAM, right? Now merge sort is relatively simple in that fashion, because after you have sorted data, if you had 10 items, basically you needed space for 10 items in your memory. Actually, I shouldn't have said items. If I have 10 splits, I need 10 keys in memory to be able to merge sort all of them. It doesn't matter how long each data item is, right? Oddly enough, my first encounter with a system like this was when I was taught COBOL, right? So one of the things in COBOL is the polyphase merge sort, which is how they merge disks, tapes together. And one of the primary criteria for tape sorting is that data can only go one way. You can only read in one direction. You can't go back and read the data, right? So after you've finished sorting all your data chunks in memory, you basically write them and keep merging them until you finally get a larger and larger linear sequence of data. So this particular example, after splitting the data into two chunks, I do two sorts, and then I do a sort minus m, which is the Unix way of doing merge sort. And then I finally pump it into my unique operator. Now, this works. This basically means that I can now do twice the amount of data processing in half the RAM, or rather, in the same amount of RAM that I used to have before. If I had 2 GB of RAM, with this I can do 4 GB of processing. Now, funnily enough, most of what applies to the leap of complexity between having one data item to having two data items, or two splits, is far more complicated than the leap from 2 to 3, right? The point where you leave the assumption that it is one single chunk of data and move to two chunks of data, it becomes far easier to move to 3 or 4 or 5. So in some sense, after you look at combining two data items, it does not make sense to actually go and look at combining 3 data items, because 3 is basically a case of 1 and 2 combined, then you combine it with the 3. Anything that you can do in a binary operation can be applied to any number of operations, right? But probably more efficiently in other ways, but anything you can do in binary can be done to a large number of operations. So now you can do as many splits as you want, as many sorts as you want, but you have a merge. But unfortunately, you realize that between the first sort, the sort 0, and the sort 1, you have to write sort 0 to disk, because as I explained, the first sort is as big as your RAM, right? You have to write it to disk. And writing it to disk is very expensive. You've just read all of data out, you're going to write all of the data back, then in a while later you're going to read all of the data back again. Fortunately, we know that we actually don't need all of the data in sort 0, right? We can cut down on the data that we write to sort 0 to disk, right, by adding the operation that we want to do finally, because it's a reducible operation. Taking unique of two lists and taking a unique of that actually works the same as taking a unique of the concatenated list, right? So unique of A plus unique of B and a whole unique is the same as unique of A plus B. Because of that property, we can actually bubble up the unique operation so that we have to write less data to disk. And if you write less data to disk, you have less data to read when it comes back. And the less data to read basically means that the merge becomes more effective, right? So you can go ahead and throw in a unique operation in the middle between your sort and your merge, right? Now, this is starting to look very interesting for the fact that you can have any number of sorts, any number of intermediate uniques, but finally you have only one merge, which is a problem. But assume that you turn this problem a level further up, and instead of just saying unique, you start counting the number of actual elements in the list. So we went from actually like simply deduplicating a list to actually calculating how many of each item is there, right? Because probably not just the vocabulary of the book is important, probably how many times you use the same word is important. And I bring up vocabulary because it's interesting. Dr. Seuss, the famous children's book writer, was given a challenge: write an entire book with 50 words, right? And with a typewriter and a notepad, he managed to actually write Green Eggs and Ham using only 50 words, right? So it's interesting in that fashion to actually look at vocabulary. But perhaps what you're more interested in, how many times does a person use the same word, right? Perhaps this data will actually help us look at how many times does the person say done, right? Or today. I don't know if anybody saw today's XKCD, which is a very appropriate for this particular instance. It's how many times is a date mentioned in books in a year, right? In all the writings that Google finds online, how many times does the same date appear? And it turns out that July 4th and September 11th appear in large quantities, way more than December 25th or Jan 1st, right? So if you wanted to do an analysis like that on something as large as a Google database, something like this would be how you would approach it, right? So in this particular example, you not only do a unique when you do the intermediate unique, you actually count how many times did the word occur, right? So A occurred twice, B occurred once, C occurred once, and when you do a merge, you actually basically take the same chunk of data, ignoring the count that you have, and only use the word to do a merge. But when you do the final count, you do not really care about the key other than the fact that A of 2 plus A of 1 becomes A of 3, right? This basically gives you sort pipe unique C, right, in a very long multi-stage form. Except, even now, it is painful because no matter what you do, you only have one unique, right? So, assuming you have a very, very fast computer and you are running unique, you're still only using one CPU for a unique, right? If you have 8 CPUs, 7 of those CPUs are just sitting idle, drawing power, doing nothing, and making you actually wait for the task to end. So, can we split the single unique operation into 2 unique operations? And probably we can if we knew how the qualities of the data that is coming into the system, right? For example, here I know that my data set consists of A, B or C, D. This could very well be A to M and N to Z, right? You could divide it in any which way you want, as long as you're almost sure that it's going to evenly split. So we do the same operations as before, except after the intermediate count, you take 2 forks. One side, the AB pile, which contains data that contains A and B, and the CD pile, which contains C in the first case. In the second case, it contains C and D. To put it in another way, if I was sorting a deck of cards, I would be making 4 piles of the 4 suits: clubs, diamonds, hearts, what is spades? Yeah. So you'd be making 4 piles of it initially, and then giving it to 4 people to sort them, right? And at the end of the process, you can just stack all the 4 together in whatever order you want, and you have a sorted deck of cards. Whereas if one person had to sit and do this, he would have to do too many operations because you have 2 comparison operators now. One, which suit is it? Which suit comes first? And 2, what is the order in that suit? Of course, this doesn't work if everybody decides where Jack and Ace ends up with. But so at this point, we have actually like split up our merges into 2 parts, our uniques into 2 parts, and finally we'll just take the deck and put them together to get the final output we want, right? So after we have complicated sort pipe unix -c so far, what is the point of doing distribution in this fashion? Like, the only point of doing distribution in this fashion is if you are running out of memory or you're running out of processing. In the sort case, we were running out of memory. In the unique case, we were running out of processing, right? Now, there is no real requirement that each of these operations sit on the same machine. Only requirement is that whatever outputs from one machine happen, or one stage happens, actually flows into the next stage. All you have to ensure in a Unix term that a pipe exists, right? But a pipe is slightly complicated for a sort because the sort has to read all the data. So all sorts can't be pipes. Sorts have to be dumped on disk or in memory or whatever. You have to look at the entire data. In some sense, this is what Hadoop does. Okay? After we have gotten this far complicating sort pipe unique C, this is exactly what Hadoop's word count program does and all of MapReduce does. Right? So, to go from left to right, we have an input format which for us was a book which we managed to chop up into words, which is what we feed into the whole system. And when we divide it into random chunks, we just give out splits to random tasks. Everybody gets 64 MB or 10,000 lines or whatever criteria used to split data. Everybody converts each value into key and value. Basically converting whatever key you gave in, attaching a 1 to it for no apparent reason. You could skip the 1 if you want because it's implicit in some sense in previous examples. And then sorting it and giving it to a intermediate step, which is called a combiner. Now, what the combiner does is, between the sort and dump to disk, it tries to reduce the amount of data it writes to disk. Exactly what we were trying to do, right? The splitter that converts it into multiple merges, that is what is commonly known as Hadoop as a partitioner, which basically lets you run multiple reduce tasks, which is what unique does. And run those unique tasks completely independent of all machines. So, in some sense, once you have complicated the system so far, it becomes increasingly clear that to even use 2 CPUs in your machine, right, you need to use stuff that is commonly used in big data systems. So, a desktop machine with 2 CPUs and to use it 100% is exactly as complicated as a big data system. Not exactly as complicated, probably, but the fundamental underpinnings of both systems, utilizing both systems optimally, are exactly the same, right? But you say, what if the data that you're getting is coming from a continuous stream, right? You can't do a sort, for instance. But perhaps you don't need to do a sort occasionally, right? Maybe you want to figure out that for your ad systems, how many clicks are coming from India? Maybe you want to figure out how many of those clicks are actually purchases. How many of those clicks are the ones we are making money off, right? So, the common mechanism that we use is tailpipe grep, right? Which is basically take the data, look at the lines that you find interesting, and then just print them out. Or put them in a file so that you can look at them later. Now, what if we push the metaphor further? What if we start using something like awk? Okay. Now, awk has this interesting feature that lets you pipe data that comes in through one input into multiple outputs. So, in this particular example, for instance, I am doing 2 things. I am dumping all data that I get into names.unsorted. At the same time, I am pumping in through a sort which writes it to a sorted list. Now, once I run data through awk once, it will do both these operations at the same time parallelly, right? That might not look very interesting, but when it gets interesting is when you realize that suddenly I can run awk inside awk, right? I can write 10 awk scripts and then just pipe them together so that if the say the line matches a post request, it goes to this particular awk. If a line matches a get request, it goes to this particular awk. And then you finally like end up with systems where, for example, this particular example is it takes the IP from an access log in HTTP Apache and figures out the geolocation as well as the URL at the same time, right? It's from an old example which tried to do analysis on a NASA HTTP log, which if anybody is looking at access logs in the internet, NASA has published a access log dump for anybody to go through if you need a large enough chunk of data. So we end up with a mechanism which takes one continuous stream of data and splits into 2 streams of data, which may or may not have the same data items, right? As you start to like split data out into multiple streams by making copies of it and sending it across, in some sense, the left branch or the top branch of the $1 has no relation to with the bottom branch of $7. After they've written in both directions. There is no relationship between $1 and $7, right? They have just gone. Now you go further with this, right? You say that you are going to write it in many ways, and that's how the other most popular big data system works, called Storm. What Storm does is it takes whatever data you get in and writes it in different directions. It can write copies of it, it can write transformations of it, it can take data, keep it for a while, process it and write it later. For example, if you want a 5-minute average, it will write every 5 minutes. It will accumulate for 5 minutes, write that data. Accumulate for 5 minutes, write that data. This creates a continuous pipeline of data, which you can just pipe together. It is exactly the same as the awk example, only on a bigger scale with multiple machines, right? And as you start building these complicated networks of data that flow data across systems, it becomes increasingly clear that even though the underpinnings of all these systems are relatively simple, there is a fundamental unit of complexity, right? It's like a single cell organism versus a human being. You understand that a human being is made of single cells, but you do not consider a human being as an entity that is just a number of cells, right? And it's not exactly that simple in a production environment where money is involved, right? Like when things fail, they have to be restarted. When there are code in there that is actually completely broken. There are people who are trying to read other people's data in the system, right? And you try to build systems which are so over capacity that you want to actually share it between people. I recently saw that in the petabyte clusters that we use, most of the jobs involve like 100 GB of data. Very rarely do they go through a petabyte of data. So in some sense, a lot of what has gone into the platform and the complexity of the systems that you look at when you look at the final result is a product of all the iterative optimizations, the security in features, the durability, the reliability of the system. All the things that you see that have happened so far from that particular sort pipe unique are mostly for these reasons rather than anything else. For example, putting data and processing in the same place is one of the main reasons why Hadoop looks so interesting, right? SQL did the same thing before, but nobody looks at SQL and says it's big data, right? That is mostly because the machines do not communicate with each other in SQL in most scenarios, because you tend to run them as single nodes unless you're running a cluster, at which point you're pretty much where we are at this point, except with more expensive hardware. Anyway, so I don't actually have a conclusion to this whole process of things. I just wanted to like talk about how even if you start from scratch and start to build things in any fashion, you end up with stuff that people had come up with in 1890 and you reinvent it poorly, right? Because you can afford to actually write bad code. You don't actually have to worry about how long does a person have to walk to fetch the next page of data, which would have been the case for the 1890s and the 1950s, right? That's pretty much what I had to talk about. Are there any questions? I am guessing that I was vague enough that there are no questions. Can you get him a mic so that the question gets on the video? Okay, somebody in the back is getting a mic.
Can you repeat that part where you said why SQL cannot be used for big data analysis? I would want to understand it further.
So the way people use SQL systems is that they tend to have single machine which runs an SQL engine to which a client talks to. And if you have two machines running SQL, right? For example, in a MySQL standard scenario, they do not talk to each other. So you can't send a query that says join, give me a sum of a table that is half in this machine, half in that machine, without actually having a MySQL cluster or some sort of cluster database. right? The best they can do is data on disk. I will process all the data that belongs to me on this machine, is what SQL systems are mostly doing. And then you buy bigger and bigger machines because you run out of capacity. Make sense? Yeah. No, it's okay. I'll repeat the question. Okay, the question was, how does big data system handle relational databases? Relational databases, the way they work, are not very different from how a big data system can function. The only real question is, can a big data system handle relational databases as efficiently? Right? The the data processing that you need can be carried across, but big data systems, like for example, Hive is an example where you run SQL on Hadoop, on MapReduce, and it does work, right? But the advantage being that the Hive machines, the machines that you're running Hive on, when you're not running Hive on, can be used for other Hadoop tasks. Whereas if you had a SQL cluster, right, when you're not processing 100 TB of data, they're just sitting there with their data in memory. Whereas in this case, you don't like, so the trade-off is that even if they're slightly less efficient when you run a query, they're more useful in other ways when you're not. Yeah?
Have that kind of data duplication for every big data aspect we design?
In some sense, yes, because at any time if a machine fails, you don't really want to say that, oops, right? So, for example, in Hadoop, the data is replicated onto a different rack, onto a different switch. I mean, onto a different rack, not really onto a different switch, but it is replicated so that you potentially have different power supplies for both of these. Right? It's a durability requirement. The term big data has nothing to do with data duplication. Data duplication is a requirement for data to be safe. So that when one chunk goes away, you potentially have two chunks, and you can compare between them to see if either of them are corrupt. Right? So it's basically like a consensus mechanism. You could use it as a consensus mechanism, but essentially what it means is that you can actually distribute data in such a way that a power failure for an entire rack, somebody tripping over a power cable, doesn't actually destroy all your big data. Yeah?
Workflow, or is it different in any way?
It is very different. It is not, it is like MapReduce, but what you actually do is that it's a continuous stream of data. It is an unbounded queue of data. So it's a stream, but at any point when you read data out of it, you get what you want. For instance, if you use a hashtag on Twitter, right? Assume that it gets posted to that hashtag's feed. This tweet ID goes to that hashtag's feed. Whenever somebody searches for that hashtag, the data is already like piped into that search DB. So it's a way of classifying data, but in a way that one thing belongs in many classes. For example, when I sort a deck of cards, each card has only one final position. This is like sorting a deck of cards, saying that this card is an ace, put it in the ace pile. This card is a heart, put it in the heart pile. So I get two cards out of each card. Yeah, in some sense it's the immediacy that is, but more importantly, it is the fact that you basically want like a view of the data passing through it. But for the case of that, what the demonstration I had was that the same data goes in different directions so that you can process them differently. For all you know, one of the data streams could end up in a MapReduce job. And every 10 minutes you run the MapReduce job. Right? It's a classification framework which simplifies a lot of things. Yeah.
So in most real vast gulf between your compute part, storage, and storage is what becomes a bottleneck.
I can't hear. Storage can't be?
So in most real systems, there's a rather large gulf between the compute part you have and the storage bandwidth that you have.
Yeah.
And relational databases do a ton of stuff to sort of work around your storage bottleneck.
Yeah.
So how does Hadoop these big data systems, how do they?
So Hadoop is only one of the big data systems. There are big data systems which hold all data in memory, right? There's something written in Scala, Spark, which holds all data in memory, for instance. There is one of my favorite toys called mincemeat.py, which is a small single file MapReduce framework in Python, right, which I use. Those systems do hold all the data in memory, but the comment that you're making about loading data up from disk and tricks like that are not generally used in Hadoop, mostly because most of the data that you write will never be read again, unless somebody really wants to go look at it later.
Okay, so they assume that the initial data is large and post-reduce it will be small enough that it doesn't matter.
Most of the efficient systems, efficient uses for MapReduce are basically reducing data. Anything that results in equal amounts of data makes it really painful. Equally painful is getting data into Hadoop, by the way, because you get files and you have to keep feeding them in an organization which maintains what days, where. There's something called hcatalog which lets you catalog data. So people take this basic concept and build optimizations and build, in some sense, crutches to help them use it better.
Fair enough.
Yeah. Okay, done.
Good morning all. Hacker spaces are on the first floor. Interested guys can move over there.